Hello, everyone. We will be starting momentarily. I'm gonna start at 11 o'clock. How's everyone doing? Hope everyone is enjoying SawCon so far. Good. I'm doing well. I've been very busy the last couple of days, as you can probably imagine. Also, good to know that low latency on YouTube is still like 15 seconds. Hello, everyone. Looking forward to the Hive Swap stream. That is awesome. I'm excited about running that. I'm really excited about the stuff we've got to show to everyone. So yeah, it's gonna be a good time. All right. Well, it is almost 11, so I'm gonna get started now. I hope everyone's ready to learn some stuff about writing for visual novels. This is a panel. It is not going to teach you how to make a visual novel in the sense that I'm not going to tell you how to like use Ren'Py or whatever. This is more like a writing technique panel because one thing I've noticed is that there tends to be a very heavy focus on the technical aspects and not so much on the more sort of like creative aspects in terms of like writing techniques when it comes to intro panels. SawCon streams will be VODs, as many as we can get. This one is going to be a VOD. So, actually, I'm going to try something here. There we go. I'm going to record a high-quality version of this, too. So, yeah, so I'm going to do a panel on some writing techniques. Hopefully this will work. There we go. So, I suppose I should establish my credentials, because nobody's heard of me, ever. So as far as like writing stuff, I'm the current director and lead writer of Friend Sim 2. I've also written a few other visual novels. I've worked on some non-Homestuck stuff. We did a short visual novel called Welcome to Your First Day at Amazicom, which I was the lead and primary writer for, which is available on the Studio June itch. It's a fun little time loop game. I've also written on a number of zines. I most recently wrote the Dirk Roxy route for the Moirail zine, which is available now. I've also written for a bunch of other zines in the fandom, and I've written a lot of words of fan fiction, as one does normally. And then I've got my standard appeals to authority. I'm extremely quiet. Okay, cool. I'm going to bring my mic up a little bit here. I can't do that. Cool. I'm going to get closer to the mic and talk louder. So yeah, I've got... Actually, I think we had this problem before. Give me a second. All right. All right, cool. Anyway... Hopefully this will be better. I'm going to get closer to the microphone and talk louder. That's the solution here. Possible to make the sound. Yeah, I can boost that. Give me 1 second. Okay, hopefully that'll be better. Let me know if I'm sounding a little louder. I think I am. Hopefully I am. Yeah, while I wait for the delay to catch up with my adjusting the gain on my mic, I'm also, oh, that's better. Cool. Awesome. Thank you. As far as appeals to authority go, I am one of the directors of this con. I've been the director of SawCon since the third SawCon. I've been involved since the second, and I'm also currently a producer on Hive Swap Act 3. I'm not one of the writers, but I do work with the writers and the other production people. So Yeah, I've never heard of it either before. I just kind of wondered in here. So yeah, we're going to get into this because I got a bunch of stuff and I want to get through as much of it as I can. So I'm going to start out with a little example, if you will. So this is a very short story, which won't take long. Please enjoy the Control-Alt-Delete comic on the right. You find yourself walking down a path through the woods. Above you, the canopy turns the sunlight into a stained glass cacophony of light and color. As you walk, you hear the soft pad of your feet underneath you, your boots tapping out a slow 1-2 beat on the hard pack of the trail. The waterfall you've been looking for should be right up ahead, but this climb is already starting to wear you down. Maybe there's another way to get to the falls. So just a little story relevant to nothing right now, but let's recontextualize that a little bit. You find yourself walking down a path through the woods. Above you, the canopy turns the sunlight into a stained glass cacophony of light and color. As you walk, you hear the soft pad of your feet underneath you, your boots tapping out a slow 1-2 beat on the hard pack of the trail. I'm going to turn that sound down a little bit. There we go. The waterfall you've been looking for should be right up ahead, but this climb is already starting to wear you down. Maybe there's another way to get to the falls. All right, what should we do? Should we continue up the hill or find another way? Find another way. Continue. We have a tie. Let's vote now. Find another way. Find another way. I don't remember who made this background track, but it's from the Technicolor Heart stuff in Friend Sim 2. All right, so let's find another way. You're not really interested in hiking uphill any more than you have to, so you decide to change course and take the trail that leads down to the lake. Down here by the water, you can smell the scent of the minerals carried in the lake and the vegetal undertones of water plants. You make your way around the bend, glancing appreciatively at an especially large frog as you go. Good old frog, nothing beats that. You can hear the falls before you get to them, the steady rush of water over the rocks. And finally, you clear the trees and see your goal. You might have taken the long way around, but this was absolutely worth the wait. Plus, you didn't have to walk up a hill. All right, so the point of this little exercise is two things. One is you just saw the same basic story contextualized in two different ways. One as a little paragraph and one as an interactive element. And the other is a little like writing technique, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So basically, my thesis on visual novels and games in general is that the interactivity of it matters a lot, which is not a super hot take or a particularly like mind-blowing insight. But the fact that you have the ability to interact with a story, even in a very small way, matters in terms of how you perceive the story. The consequences of your choices, or illusion of choice, which we'll get to, that allows you to create a response to the narrative. And then the pacing and timing are also impacted by interactive elements. So like the fact that you're choosing to work in an interactive medium right away is going to impact your writing, and it's going to impact how your audience perceives things. Briefly, we're going to get through this fast because we don't have a lot of time and we got a lot of information. So I like to categorize visual novels because there's different aspects of interactivity, and there's different levels of interaction that they have, and also different elements. So, hold on here. I'm trying to get chat as well. All right. So like at the very basic level, you have what's called a kinetic novel, which is just a visual novel that you just click and it goes from one screen to the next in a linear path. There's no branching, there's no interactive elements. It's just a way of presenting the story. It has multimedia elements, etc. So think something like a lot of the Studio Elan games, so things like Highway Blossoms or Hearts in the Woods. Cyclonials is another example of a kinetic novel where you just go from point A to point B, But the pacing is determined partly by the user and partly by, like, if the game auto-progresses. Sort of one level up in interactivity, you've got branching narrative. So these are games like Friendsim or PesterQuest where you have a mostly linear narrative that occasionally says, hey, what do you want to do? And at that point, you'll branch off into a different story. That may mean that you go to a completely different ending. It may mean that there's just some slightly different dialogue, but you get the ability to make at least one decision. Another type of interaction is you have what I like to call social interaction simulators or dating sims. Those are things where you have more like gamified elements. So you have the ability to interact with characters, build up relationships, and then have that influence the narrative. So that's going to add another layer of complexity and interaction to it that's based around character dynamics. And then you have like deduction puzzle games. So this is things like Ace Attorney or Danganronpa, which I would argue is a visual novel primarily. These are games that combine the visual novel style of like a character talks to you and then puzzle and deduction elements. So things like looking for clues, solving puzzles, doing the minigame trial sequence thing at the end. And then, of course, there are lots of other types of visual novels. There's visual novels that have like mini games, or they're based around a specific type of gameplay, or they combine visual novel elements with walk-around elements, like that kind of stuff. But for our purposes, like the basics are like low to high interactivity. All right. So basic interaction, as I was saying, like the fact that you allow the player to interact with the thing at all is important. So like this is just saying you can do something as a player, and the game will respond to you. So clicking forward, and the important thing from a writer's perspective is that you're giving the player control, which allows them to like feel like they have some input on the story, which is also going to mean that you have to think about that when you're pacing it. Like in a novel, you're like, okay, I'm writing a block of text. The reader is going to scan through it. When you have the ability to break that text and say they're going to make a distinctive action to move to the next path or the next scene, then you have a little bit more control over how you shape that narrative. But also you're making it more of like a collaborative effort between you and the player. Kind of stepping up from that, if you have a branching narrative, you are not only giving them the ability to interact with your pacing, you're also giving them some input in the outcome of the story. So you're allowing things to change to some degree. Now that doesn't have to be particularly big. Like for example, in the little visual novel section we did earlier, the choice of which way you go doesn't really matter. Ultimately, like you get to the same destination, the game takes you to the same place, but there's some context that changes. Like you get a different in-between section, and you also get a little contextual like, hey, you did this thing earlier. So when you're writing, like the branching doesn't necessarily need to be a lot, but it definitely gives the player a sense of control and a sense of change, which is something that we're going to get to in the second part of this. There's a reason why I'm kind of like going over this very quickly, which you'll see soon. Another layer of interaction is the ability to include character interaction. This would be things like dialogue choices or characters remembering things that you do. This is very common with social interaction visual novels. Like you have a relationship with this character, and based on that value that the game tracks, you have like different options to respond to that. So you can have a character who doesn't talk to you unless you know them well enough, or they respond differently if they don't like you, that kind of thing. So like you're adding a layer to your characters where they stop feeling like just characters in a book, and they start feeling like characters you can talk to, like an interactive character, which I would think it's a very important element to visual novels in particular, because you tend to very much focus on character writing. Also, excuse me if I'm clearing my throat, I have allergies. Another element of interaction, which I think is overlooked with visual novels, this is something that gets focused on more with point-and-click adventure games, is what I call nonlinear interaction. This is things that happen not necessarily in a specific sequence. So, like, clicking on an object and getting a description, that kind of thing. Or like, interacting with a puzzle and getting some kind of narrative aspect of that. So it's like, in a visual novel, if you're willing to put in the work to, like, have more nonlinear sequences, like, your player is going to have a lot of control over that. Now, you as the writer have to think about that, because, like, part of the trade-off here is that you have no control over the pacing here. Like, they can click on stuff, you know, as much as you allow them to. But, you know, the advantage there is that they get a lot more control over their own interaction with the narrative. Do people not think Danganronpa is a visual novel? I think people are split on that. All right. Next up. And then the last sort of category of interaction that I wanted to highlight for visual novels is what I call persistent interaction. This is the game has the ability to remember choices that you make. This is the old, if you've played any Telltale game, the character will remember this line. We'll get back to that line, and we'll get back to the Telltale games in a couple of minutes, because, like I said, there's a reason why I'm going so quickly over this. So this is basically just you as a writer of a visual novel have the ability to track information that persists when the game is turned off. You can remember variables. You can remember, like, whether the player has done certain things, whether or not they've completed certain things, whether or not they've achieved certain achievements. And you could do anything from just having a little bit of Easter egg dialogue, like, hey, congratulations, you beat this minigame, to actually, like, tracking how characters feel about you across episodes of a game. This is particularly important if you want connectivity between either sequels to a game or between episodes of a serialized game. So, like, with Friendsim 2, this is something we do a lot, where, you know, your choices in a previous volume are carried forward. So yeah, that's something to think about, is, like, you have the ability to do this, and you can use it to give your narrative sort of like a fuller sense. And wow, we've gotten through so much in only 15 minutes. It's almost like there's a big chunk of the panel that is a surprise. That's right. The fine art of lying all the time. The trick to visual novel writing is you have to be sneaky. Ahaha, this is actually like 60% of the panel. I've tricked you all. So my big thesis for this, the thing that you're actually here to listen to, is that writing in games in general, and especially in visual novels, is a careful balance of writing something authentic and lying through your teeth to your player base. Because there's a lot of things you can do to flesh out your world and make your game feel bigger, more interactive, more deep than it really is. Because it's hard to write a game. There's a lot of stuff to do. There's a lot of things to keep track of. And you never want your game to feel one note or shallow. You want it to feel like a full experience. And there's things you can do to kind of, like, fake it. And as we're going on, I'll give examples, because games do this all the time, especially games with branching narratives. A little bit of misinformation. As any writer will tell you, lying is an important part of writing. Controlled lying, that's what writing is. So I have a bunch of sort of, like, I've categorized these by no particular reason, but I have a bunch of illusions. So I have the illusion of choice. And this is giving the player it's giving the player the sense that they have choices when they don't actually have choices. So that, coming back again to the convergent paths in the woods, like, you basically, like, imagine you're walking on a trail in the woods, and you come to one of these, like, forks where the trail branches off, and you take a path, left or right, it doesn't matter, and then after a little while, the trails come back together again, and you're on the same path again. So, like, from the standpoint of the narrative goal, you're in the same place. but you've taken a different path. So, like, this can be stuff like having a choice and then having, like, a few different lines of dialogue. And, like, players will not know when the decision they're making is, like, a big decision that actually matters, or it's, like, a little dialogue decision. And that can have advantages and disadvantages. So, like, you can create a greater sense of weight to the decision making because you've given them a choice and they don't know that it's a choice that doesn't really matter in the end. I discovered this, like, how important this is with Friend Sim 2 because people were asking if, like, this random choice that I just put in to make, like, more interesting dialogue was, like, important to later in the game. And it's like, I never stopped to think that people would think that, like, every decision they were making had long-term weight and not just the one critical one that I know is important, but why would they know? So the caveat here, the but watch out, is that you need to be careful with this because, like, if you're trying to disguise the lack of, like, importance to the choices, but you do have decisions that are, like, super important, actual branching, change the whole narrative, you may want to consider, like, the balance of, you know, how much you're making it look important versus how much it actually is important. You know, not necessarily fully signposting everything, but, like, allowing, yeah, that's a good point. Actually, and someone in chat says people like to keep track of important choices because of completionism, and that is, like, something to think about. It's like you may want to give a little, like, weight to a specific decision and be like, hey, this is, like, a big thing. Like, again, getting back to Friend Sim 2, like, in every route you get a choice that weights you towards salvation or revolution, and sometimes it's, like, a few choices that add up, and sometimes it's one big moment. But, like, originally the game just literally told you which was which. And then during writing, we decided as a writing team, like, hey, that's kind of stupid. Let's not do that because it makes it, like, too, I felt like it made it too gamified. So you can do things like, you know, you've got the weight of the dialogue where it's like, hey, this is a big decision you gotta make. And then you can have, decisions such as Jade Shirt Icon. Excellent point, Hussy Hints. So, like, you have... And also, yeah, that's the other side to this. If you make a choice feel like it has a lot of weight and then it means literally nothing, that can let your audience down and it can make them feel like, oh, you know, the decisions I'm making are not super important. I've actually got, I believe I have a panel. Actually, that's literally the next panel. So good transition. Second type of illusion is the illusion of importance. So very much connected to the last one, but this is more about making the player feel like a decision is important when it might not necessarily be. Or I suppose making it feel like it's not important when it is. Whatever. So, like, if you've established that your choices matter in the game, like, for example, Telltale games, they like the original Walking Dead, made a big deal out of, like, the choices you're making will matter. You know, the character will remember this. You're making a big decision. And the thing is, if you actually look at the graph of, like, what decisions matter in the first Telltale Walking Dead game, there's, like, 2 decisions that actually have, like, long-term lasting consequences and a bunch that kind of don't. And, like, that's kind of an interesting approach to writing. It's like, well, you've made your job easier as a writer because you don't have to, like, write, 50 different branching paths, but also, like, it's a really careful balance because if your players start to suspect that that's what you're doing, they're going to start doubting every decision that you give them. So unless you're trying to make a game that's somehow based around that narrative feeling, like, you gotta watch yourself. And you might want to give them some payoff for the really big decisions. Like, again, like I was saying, if you have, like, a narrative weight behind this and you're like, man, this is a really big choice you're about to make, player. Hey, what do you want to do? And then it's just like, your response to that is like, yeah, cool. And then it just keeps going. Like, that is going to potentially erode player trust. So, like, my theory, or my philosophy on it is, even if the payoff isn't huge, the decision should still have some impact on the narrative. Even if it's not ultimately going to matter, and like, as a writer, you can kind of like wrap things back around where it's like, okay, I want this decision to not ultimately matter to the end goal, but like, you as the writer have the ability to kind of pull things back where it's like, oh, I made this decision, but then something happens and allows you to, you know, kind of get to where you want to go without making the player necessarily feel like you're bullshitting them. So, interesting question in chat, worth answering. But why lie to your players at all if you don't want to erode player trust? So, as I was saying, like, this is a balance between your ability to create a big feeling narrative as a writer and the trust that your players have that you're being upfront with them. So, like, the reason that you do any of this is you want to create a narrative that feels larger and more important than it really is, because that's, like, what all games do all of the time. Like, if you're playing an open world game, the game feels like you can go anywhere and do anything. You actually cannot. You are very carefully bounded in, and if the game is written well and designed properly, then it won't feel like you're penned in, even if you really are. And this is like the words version of that. Like, you want your player to feel like they're part of a big living world and a narrative that has a million choices and that can go anywhere. But you're carefully kind of like restricting things so that you as the writer can actually like get things done and actually finish your writing and actually have a game come out. So, you know, you'll see this a lot with choice-based games. Another big example was the Until Dawn game, where again, the game made a big deal out of like, hey, this choice is going to matter, and ultimately like only a couple choices mattered. So, you know, again, you're trying to establish like the feeling that the world is bigger, the feeling that the narrative is broader, and the feeling that like everything you do is important. Like, at the end of the narrative, what you want the player to feel is like, damn, I had a real impact over that story. That was like very profound, and I really liked having that impact on the narrative that I was experiencing. You don't want them to feel like, man, this game was full of shit. So, like, again, it is a very careful balance. So, the but watch out here is you want to avoid making the key decisions seem unimportant. Like, I think the key to keeping the player's trust is when you've really signposted that something is going to matter, it should matter. Like, the little choice about, like, oh, this character's asking, like, which food you like better, or like they ask for your opinion on something and maybe that's just a couple of different dialogue paths. That's not necessarily something you have to fully explore, but if you're gonna make like a big decision that makes it feel like, oh, this is the moment, it should probably be the moment. The next illusion I have here is the illusion of depth, and this specifically isn't really related to decision making so much as it's related to the world of the game. And this is something that applies not just to games writing and not just to visual novels, but it is really important in visual novels because you have a relationship with your player where they're here for the story and the characters. They're not here for like, you know, oh, this is a game that has like fun action elements and the story is secondary to that. Like, if you're doing a visual novel, you're focusing on your story and your characters. So like, you want your world to feel like it has depth to it. You want the world to feel like it's real and lived in, but again, you have limited time and you have limited text to do this with. So like, I think effective ways to do this are like peppering in references in the dialogue and narrative that hint to something bigger outside, but not necessarily like mean that much ultimately. So like, you know, your characters talk about things that happen outside of the world that you're seeing specifically. They reference events that are occurring. They reference like political stuff or factions. Like, referencing a faction doesn't mean that you have to like fully flesh them out and keep everything you know, you don't want everything to be fully fleshed out because, again, you've got limited time and limited resources. But you do want them to feel like this is a lived-in world, and then you're giving yourself as a writer things that you can then play off of. So, like, if you offhandedly mention a faction in the world, and then they become important. So, like, I think the big caveat here is, like, this is kind of like a Chekhov's gun thing. I think that in games in general, there's a little more leeway with that. Like, people are more willing to accept some level of like world building that's just there for flavor and depth, because you want to, like, this is an experience where you feel like you're inhabiting a world, not just kind of like going through and seeing it presented to you. So like, you can have something where it's like, oh, you know, this is something that is referenced, but I'm not necessarily going to see it. But then you as the writer have the ability to draw back on that. And then the player's experience is going to be, oh, shit, I remember you referencing that thing. That's cool. That actually mattered. And like you're building a kind of like reciprocal relationship with your audience where it's like you have the ability to add verisimilitude to the world, that sense of reality. And you also have the ability to come back and draw on that. So the but watch out I have here, and this is a thing I say to people in general with writing, is that if you overdo it with world building, it's a good way to never finish what you're writing. Like, it is very tempting to say, oh, before I write a single word of dialogue, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to figure out every like aspect of this world and how it works together. And I know there are writers that approach works really well for. I'm not one of them. I kind of get like a sense of the world and what like the important things are, and then start writing actual scenes and then kind of build out from there. Like you as a writer have the ability to write more than one draft. You have the ability to go back and add stuff and revise it. You have the ability to expand on stuff in later episodes or sequels. You have the ability to do DLC. You have the ability to do all kinds of things to build out your world where you don't have to have everything done immediately. And if you try to do everything before you start writing, you'll never start writing. So J.R.R. Tolkien would have hated Homestuck / loved Homestuck. I don't know. I do agree that like the callbacks is something that can make an audience feel very invested in your world. Dirt world building. That's a good way to put it. Yeah, exactly. Like you want some framework, but like you don't want all of the framework right away. All right, next up, we have the illusion of character relationships. So this is kind of related to the depth one, except for characters instead of the world. So this is creating the sense that your relationship as the player with the characters are bigger, deeper, or more important than what they actually are. So again, as a writer, you cannot world build everything out. You don't have time for it, you don't have resources for it, and your player doesn't have the time to sit there and like read your world building document. So like what you present in the game is what you gotta go off of. And here it's like the same kind of thing where you have character dialogue that you want the character dialogue to feel impactful, and you want it to have reactivity. So you want there to be choices that the characters react to, even if the reaction isn't like a huge difference. But like, you know, if your character asks you like, what do you think about the blah 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 faction? And they have a sense of what they feel. And you say, oh, I like them. And they're like, oh, shit, yeah, they're the greatest faction ever. And if you say, I don't like them, they're like, oh, well, I didn't know how you felt about that. And it's like what you're doing is you're creating depth to the relationship between your player character and the NPCs around you. Like, it doesn't have to be a big thing. It doesn't have to be a blank will remember this. But to have the idea that, like, there's a world here, and the characters are people, which they're not. They're not people, they're characters. They exist to serve a narrative purpose, but you don't want the player to feel like they exist to serve a narrative purpose. Like, you want them to feel like they're interacting with people, with characters that have, like, a life of the mind. This is also important in terms of, like, establishing in the player's mind that the choices are meaningful for the relationships. And again, like with all these other things, if you never make that pay off, your player isn't going to trust you as a writer anymore. But if you give them these big moments where it's like, oh, you've disagreed with a character on something that they feel passionately about, and now for the rest of the game, you've set a flag as a developer that says, hey, this character now doesn't trust you. And so from then on, you've got like some key branching dialogue that says if that flag is set, then they have this separate set of dialogue that says they don't trust you. So, like, you've got the ability to take those really key moments and build them out. And then from there, you can kind of sprinkle in the smaller moments. Like, say you express some dissatisfaction with this deeply held belief, but you're not, like, outright saying you don't agree with them. And they might respond to you in a way that indicates that, hey, that kind of hurts their feelings. And you don't need to necessarily remember that specific choice, but like it's giving the player information because your player has a brain and can remember things. And then they'll see, oh, this character feels this way about this thing I said. And then when you get to that big key moment where your choice is like, hey, I'm going to shit all over that thing they care about, the player knows, oh, they didn't like it when I did that before. Maybe they're not going to like it so much now. And then that's when everything really pays off. So you're kind of like, you're using those smaller moments that aren't super important, that don't really matter from a design perspective, to establish and build up the moments that really, really matter. And that's kind of connected to the, but watch out, which is that if none of the choices ever matter, your players are going to eventually figure it out. They're going to eventually notice that no matter what you say to this person, they don't ever change the way they act towards you. You know, you say you hate them and you want their mother to die and you wish they were never born. And then the next time you talk to them, they're like, hey, how you doing, player character? I missed you a lot. And it's like, your players are going to see that and they're going to be like, wait, what the fuck is going on here? So I wonder if the segment about the earlier choice recontextualizing the same scene from earlier. I'm gonna get into that in like just sort of at the end. I'm gonna talk more sort of general writing techniques for visual novels. So holds up on multiple playthroughs. Actually, that is a good point. So I don't think every game has to hold up to multiple playthroughs, but like, it's a good test of how consistent your illusions are if you get to the end and it's like, oh yeah, if I play this again, it feels, one, if it holds up, and two, if it feels like a different experience if you choose different things. So like if you're giving the player branching choices and it's like, okay, I'm going to now be really mean to this character, or I'm going to choose all the opposite choices. Like the game should feel different. It shouldn't be just the same thing, but again. All right, next up. So this is actually connected to the question that one person just asked in chat, which is about recontextualization. So like, I call this the illusion of continuity. So this is like the sense that the game is connected with its own parts, even if it's not necessarily connected with its own parts, which is a weird sentence. So I'm gonna explain this in some detail. So basically, like, you wanted to make it look like the choices are persistent and meaningful, and you want it to be an experience that feels like the player is guiding it rather than like being led by the nose through it. I mean, again, not necessarily applicable for like kinetic novels where you literally are just guiding them through the experience, but this is something where like having small references to choices can help a lot. Or, again, going back to the fact that your player has a brain and has a memory, you can recontextualize stuff with like writing that makes it like, oh, I'm just off the cuffing here, but for example, say early on in the story, you get a choice to talk to a character, and you have two choices, and one of them, like, deeply upsets the character, and they get mad at you, and then nothing seems to come of it. And the other choice, like, they go off and do something else unrelated, but you get some context for what they're doing. And then later in the story, you find out that the character has, like, left town. And the contextualization there is, like, if you chose to upset that character, the player may think, oh, hey, maybe that thing that I said is, like, part of why they left town. And if the player had this other context, they might think, oh, that event that happened is why they left town. Or maybe there's a deeper mystery that gets established there. Like, again, it's balancing how much work you want to do as a writer in terms of, like, actually writing these branches versus how much work you want to kind of offload to the player's assumptions. Because they aren't necessarily going to make those assumptions, but, like, you can kind of infer. So, like, that's kind of the first bullet point, where it's like making look like choices will persist even if they don't, or only in small ways. The other one is, and this is kind of like related to like extensions of the game, sequels, or episodic games, is hand-waving multiple endings into one, which is really hard to do. A lot of games have tried to do it. The one I always think of is the Deus Ex, where its sequel is kind of like, which ending happened? All of them. And it's like, it's a very challenging thing to do, is to try to take a bunch of different possible choices and make it feel like, well, it didn't matter, but all of them also mattered. How Morrowind ended, probably. I don't remember. But yeah, so, sorry, I'm reading through. There's only one ending. So, like, yeah, you can have all of the Morrowind endings happen concurrently in Oblivion. Yes, actually, that is true. So, and yeah, Life is Strange is a bad offender of this. So, like, this is a huge double-edged sword in that, on the one hand, if you are able to pull it off, it can feel like, oh, whatever choice I meant mattered, and, like, it worked into the context of the next game, or either of the choices could have existed. That's the other way to approach this, is, like, having the player be in a position where they aren't sure what the canon choice is, but, like, it also kind of doesn't matter because you could kind of interpret it either way. But yeah, it's like it can be a big problem, or it can help to ease the burden of your work. Someone mentions Fear and Hunger in the chat. Actually, excellent example and a game I really like. And you can have, that's the kind of, like, multiple endings could have happened and it's not clear which one. As someone else mentions, having better choices leading to the same but somewhat fuller ending. That's another choice that a lot of games go with, the kind of, like, true ending approach. Fear and Hunger, I love the Fear and Hunger games, actually. It's always nice when I see other people that enjoy them. I really, really like them, and I really like their approach to storytelling, especially the second game. But yeah, so it's like, again, difficult to pull off, but it's like, again, it's a balance of how much work do I want to do versus how much, like, veracity do I want to establish with my continuation. And then again, this is the but watch out. If your writing isn't actually clever, it can make the seams between different parts of the whole feel very jarring. Like, this is hard to do. I don't know. There's no formula to it. You just need to try it and then, like, read what you've written, send it to other people, get feedback on whether or not it works, and then revise it. So, like, a very tricky thing to do. The last thing I have, before we kind of, like, do a general sort of closeout, is the illusion of interactivity. So this is something that is very unique to games writing. It is, I think, not unique to visual novels, but it is something to consider. And this is basically the idea that you want the world to feel more interactive than it really is. And this is going to be big because a lot of visual novels are not super interactive. And it's like, okay, so we've kind of covered some of that with like some of the choice-based stuff, but there's some other stuff you can do. And it's kind of like giving the player things to like play with in the environment. So like, for example, visual novels that have point and click elements, like the Ace Attorney games, you can add stuff where it's just like, oh, you can like look at this thing in the environment and you get some description, or you get a little side dialogue, or you get some like context for lore. Someone mentioned Dark Souls earlier in context of endings, and Dark Souls is the undisputed king of doing lore through like item descriptions and stuff, where you give the player like additional information about things that's not necessarily critical, but it helps to build that context. It helps them to feel like they're part of this world. And then another thing is actual game systems that add to the feeling of interaction, and this is like things like adding time cycles, so like day-night cycles, even very simple ones, adding mini-games, adding quick-time events, allowing for traversal, so that would be like a map or the ability to move from area to area. So like, if you've played the Technicolor Heart game within a game inside of FriendSim 2, I did all of these just as like a experiment, basically. And it's like, yeah, you can move around from location to location and talk to different people in the map, and they move around at different times of the day. And like, not everything means a whole lot. Like, it's like if you go to the area that has no one there, then, you know, nothing is likely to happen. Although there are some key events that happen as you just like wander the world. And then giving the player just things to do. Like, for example, in Technicolor Heart, you can talk to Malik and you can play Tetris on his little Game Boy thing. You can do the streaming games with Elward and Sarava. Like, you can do things that are not necessarily like super important, but they add to the level of like the feeling that the world exists as a real place. The caveat here is that, one, the interactive elements take work to create, and two, they can start to feel very like tacked on, especially if they're not well integrated. So like, you know, it's the example I always think of and always use as a what not to do is like a lot of the David Cage games. So think of things like Detroit Become Human or Heavy Rain, which like, they do a lot of interactivity where it's just like, yeah, you can turn a door handle by like rotating the controller and pulling it back and shifting it over to the side. And it's like, okay, but like, what are you adding by doing that? It's like it's not how you open doors in real life. It doesn't feel natural. It doesn't add anything to the game. It's just kind of there to make things feel like, quote unquote, more interactive. And it's like, doing stuff like that, it's like this just feels like an extra bit of crap that gets in the way of the narrative. Like if your interactive elements are standing in the way of the narrative feeling like complete and whole and fully featured and like coherent, they're probably not good. Like, you know, again, if your world is one where you want it to feel like the person's moving around, but yeah, someone says there's a visual novel I played a while ago that had an entire big mini game on a computer, but had nothing to do with the narrative, and it felt kind of jarring. Yeah, like that kind of thing where it's like, oh, suddenly it's minigame time. You know, why? Why is it minigame time? Like, is the minigame story relevant? Is it a cutaway? You know, one of the things, we're all Homestuck fans here. One of the things Homestuck is really notable for is it has these walk-around sections. But the thing is, like, the walk-around sections feel like they come as part of the narrative, where it's like, oh, we're going to do, like, a different perspective on this story. But it's not like, it doesn't feel jarring narratively. It's not like, oh, random minigame in the middle of things, fuck you, now back to the story. It's a way of advancing the story. We tried to do this in FriendSim 2 as well with, like, the walk-around sections, where it's like, oh, we're going to go here and we got to do a thing. Now you're playing as Skyla and you have to like do the thing you just talked about. So like, there's also one moment in Friendsim 2 that I'm personally very proud of in Volume 3 where it's like, it switches back and forth between the walk around section and the context for like why that's important. So it's like Mispar is like, hey, don't worry about it. Go do some violence, Connell. And then you kind of have this realization that like, oh shit, she's going to go kill a bunch of people. So it snaps back and forth between you playing as Connell going to do some violence and Mispar being like, oh shit, I need to stop this. And then everything kind of like converges in the end. And it's like, that's the payoff to that like back and forth. So it's like, think of it the way that certain stories, like not stories, but like a television show will cut back and forth between two perspectives. Like you can do that with the level of interactivity in the game. And that allows you to kind of like, again, you're crafting the experience the player has, and you're tailoring things so that you as a developer or a writer can do it and get it done, which is the ultimate challenge for all writing and game development. And, also good example, the Trickster mode minigames where the pointlessness is the point. Like, again, do not have a low tolerance for interactive elements that don't add anything. I agree. Yeah, like I think the interactivity is like, you should make the world feel bigger and more expansive, but they should either be very optional things that the player doesn't have to engage with, or that they mean something. Like another example is like adding interactive like phones or something where you can like look at text messages from the characters, and they might not necessarily be like core to the experience of the story, but they add context, or maybe they present story elements. I think that's a very interesting technique. What do you think about Slay the Princess? I really like Slay the Princess. And yeah, so this is the end of the prepared slides. I'm going to kind of like off the cuff for a few minutes, just talking about some of the things I'm seeing in chat. Thing about all these illusions is that by nature, they will inevitably work better for some people than others. That is absolutely true. Some people are very, very, they're very willing to suspend disbelief. They're very willing to immerse themselves in your world. Some people are going to be much more reluctant about it. Also, some people are going to be very like keyed into these kind of things. Like if you play a lot of games, if you're very like well versed in the way games work, like one of the stories I tell people from time to time is when I was a kid, I really liked the game Doom, the original 1993 Doom, and I started working on editing it. And eventually I got very good at editing Doom levels, but I could never look at the original game the same. Like when I first played Doom, I was like, oh, it can do all of these things. And then when I started to actually expose its limitations, it's like, oh, no, it can't. And it's like, it's not necessarily going to ruin your experience, but it does change it. It recontextualizes how you look at the thing. Same if someone is very familiar with Ren'Py, like, you know, the tricks are gonna be more exposed. Someone asked, do you have any experience with TTRPGs? And if so, do you think similar rules apply there? I think absolutely yes, because again, a TTRPG is an experience of having a very big, very open world, but like you kind of have to roll with the fact that your players aren't necessarily going to go into the plot you want them to. And like the advantage of the TTRPG is that you as the DM can do this in real time. So you can adjust, you know, you don't have to think in advance necessarily. You just have to be ready to react on your feet. But like the concepts are very similar. You know, you're creating a world that feels bigger than it really is. Knowing the magic trick works changes things. Absolutely. Someone asked, how do you feel about the inclusion of things like audio tapes to kind of expand the world building? I enjoy that kind of thing. I like audio logs and diaries, games like Signalis, where it adds like these little elements of the world that are mostly optional unless they have like puzzle solutions, but they add to the sense of how big a place it is. Signalis is another very good example of like world building that is there, but not necessarily super important to the core gameplay, but it's definitely like it makes the world feel bigger. You know, you get a sense of like, hey, there's this whole thing out there. And I don't know all of it, but I know it's there. And like in some ways that mystery can make the experience deeper for your player because their brain is going to fill in the gaps. Like sometimes less is more is the old trope, but like sometimes it is. Sometimes you want to allow the player to kind of fill in the gaps and make things feel bigger for them. So like, again, it's always a balancing act. I think that as a writer, you know, you need to kind of approach it from the perspective of like, how would somebody who is not familiar with this world approach this? How would someone not familiar with these characters approach it? And then once you're done with your first draft, you got to get other people's opinions and be like, hey, does this work? I'm seeing Valhalla, VA11, HALLA. I have played some of it. I haven't played all of it. I haven't played enough of it to have an opinion on it, unfortunately. Someone mentioned Slay the Princess, which I think is a really good example of how, like, cyclical decisions can be used. So I didn't really get into this because it kind of didn't fit with the other things. But, like, I'm a big fan of, like, cyclical choices where you make a choice and it kind of loops back in. So actually the game that I mentioned at the beginning, the Welcome to Your First Day at Amazicom, is a game where you play through the same day over and over again, but like the choices you make like recontextualize or change the way that each day progresses. So it's a combination of recontextualization through writing and just choices you make. Time loops, yeah. Another very Homestuck thing to talk about. So I'm progressive time loops, my love. Yeah, it's the old spiral approach to time loops. Do you know about In Stars and Time? I have not heard of that. Is that a visual novel? If so, I'll check it out regardless. Yeah, so I mean, as with all things, none of these are absolute. You must do this. There's always exceptions to the rules. Feel free to break them, however works. But like, you know, my approach to writing games is basically like, I want the player to feel like this is a world that they're in. Our Wonderland. Ooh, interesting. Our Wonderland to you. In Stars of Time isn't a visual novel, but was mentioned because of a recent monochromatic time loop narrative. Awesome. I will check that out. I'm always interested in learning more about interesting games. Yeah, like I think that like ultimately game writing is a lot like when it comes to narrative games, there's a lot of bleed through. Like people talk about visual novels like they're completely separate from other games, but it's like that's not true. Like It's just you know, it's a process of creating a world and making the player feel like they're invested in it and building character and building an interesting story. And like the techniques you have available to you are very the ultimate trick to writing a visual novel is that there isn't an ultimate trick to writing a visual novel. Like there are games writing techniques for narrative games, and a lot of them cross over. And, like, you should be aware of the specific limitations of your visual novel and, like, your engine and everything. But also, like, you have the ability to craft this narrative without having to be like, I've got to do this specific way. You don't have to copy, you know, the visual novel that you're most familiar with. Like, one of the things with friends or with the Homestuck fandom is, like, there is a tendency to copy like Friendsim and Pester Quest, because for a lot of Homestuck fans, that's like their first major visual novel. And like you have the ability to break outside of that and experiment with different techniques. And that is cool and awesome, and you should do that. Like you can take a formula and kind of iterate off of it and put a twist to it. And that's another way you can kind of like play with your players' expectations, is you're like, oh, I'm going to get this one story, it's going to be like Friendsim, but again. And it's like, nope, it's not going to be like Friendsim, but again, because we've done a few things to change the narrative. Not necessarily mechanically, but like how it's written, how the characters are written, how the game responds to your choices. So yeah, there's a lot to go into. This is like a topic that could go on forever, but I wanted to kind of give my approach to things. idea of the time loop is easier to follow because the player is already interacting with time by playing the game. That is a good point. Like that, as I mentioned in the very beginning, the fact that the player is interacting with your game already matters. Like, kinetic novels are minimally interactive, but they are still interactive. Like, a kinetic novel is not, you do not interact with a kinetic novel the way you interact with a book in print. You don't interact with it the way you interact with a movie. Like, it has its specific interaction pattern, and like that is going to guide pacing. Like it's the old case of like form shapes function to some degree. Like the form of the visual novel, the form of how you present the text, the form of how you pace things, and how you let the player interact with things is important. So, hell yeah, I'm gonna wrap this up because we got a panel coming up at noon. Bye bitches. If you like this, check out my other SOCCON panels. I've done 2 writing panels with some other people I've collaborated with. I also did a panel called Carcat Goes to a Project Management Seminar, which is all about running fan projects, specifically larger ones. I'm at Janiyah Riley like everywhere. You can check me out. Go to my AO3 if you want to read my writing. And you should also definitely play Friendsim 2, which is a unofficial sequel to Friendsim and PestraQuest, kind of. It's fun. A lot of the things I've talked about here are used. I'm not the only writer, but I am the main writer in collaboration with a few other people. So if you want to see some of how I've applied these things and how that's changed over a couple of years, check that out. Volume 13 is going to be coming out 10/25, so check that out. Check out the trailer. Yeah, I hope everyone got something out of this. I hope you found it at least somewhat informative, and I hope you're enjoying the con. We got a lot more panels. I think, what's coming up after me? I'm not sure. I don't have the schedule in front of me, but yeah. Hope people liked it. This will be available on demand if you want to go back and look at anything. Cool. Yeah, everyone enjoy SOCCON, and I will see y'all later. Bye.